it's moral support, but also material help, and a reminder to Putin that the U.S. is not going to waver and that Ukraine is going to accomplish as much as it can.
Now, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has promised $1 billion in aid to Ukraine. He was visiting Kyiv. Earlier, I spoke to Daniel Lippman, who's Washington reporter for Politico. He told me what comprised that $1 billion package.
This is a pretty big $1 billion package. And of course, there's going to be millions of dollars of weapons, including these uranium depleted bullets and ammunition that actually are not nuclear. It's just that it's this pretty armor piercing, tougher than lead ammunition. And so that's going to be very useful for the Ukrainians. But there's hundreds of millions of dollars of economic assistance and anti-corruption funding and humanitarian assistance as well. And what the Ukrainians are happy about is that this is grant money, not loans, because they don't want to be in debt, of course.
Yeah. And if you could sort of analyse what you think the US's motivations are in providing this.
Well, I think the motivations are similar to previous aid packages, which is to buck up the Ukrainians and help them try to defeat Vladimir Putin in Russia, especially after the counteroffensive has not gone as well as the US and the Ukrainians have wanted. It's only taken a town or two, and it is very slow going. And there's a lot of doubts in Washington about the effectiveness and when the Ukrainians might say, hey, let's come to the negotiating table. And so this is a way to help them materially, but also with another visit, the fourth so far during the war, from Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
To what extent is it the US saying to the Kremlin and to sort of Western allies that we're not going to back down here?
I think that's a big part of it, that it's moral support, but also material help, and a reminder to Putin that the U.S. is not going to waver and that Ukraine is going to accomplish as much as it can, especially before a potential Republican president who might be more isolationist and not help out the Ukrainians as much and push them towards the bargaining table. And this all comes at a time when Putin is now stronger internally politically after he is widely seen as having killed his chief domestic rival, Yevgeny Prigozhin of the Wagner Group, in that plane crash last week.
You've just touched on it there, but presumably the next sort of year or so, the US is going to be quite concerned with domestic politics. And how much might that mean we see a differing of support provided to Ukraine?
Before the election, I don't think that it's going to have huge effects because the administration has a good deal more money that they can, but they're asking for more money from Congress. And if the U.S. public is focused on other stuff like the election campaign, then Congress can kind of approve it without having to really get too much input from the public, because the public is broadly supportive of this aid and helping Ukraine, but on some of the details they may not be aware. And this is such a small portion of the defense budget and the overall U.S. government's budget that it's not like the U.S. can't afford it. But no one in Washington wants a 30-year war. I think they'd rather have this come to a conclusion in the next year or two.
Yeah. And the question is how likely that will be. Blinken said, we want to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs, not only to succeed in the counteroffensive, but what it means for the long term. To what extent is the government currently saying, look, the support is right now for as long as it's needed? Because promises like that can be made for the next year, but not beyond that, can they?
Yeah, you can't. If Trump is ahead of the polls in October of 2024, those assurances would not have that much credibility. And so it's trying to get Ukraine to as good of a position by the election or by the inauguration if there's a isolationist Republican president, of which there are several on the stage, but there's also people like Nikki Haley who are pretty anti-Russia, and so there'd be no let up in support from her. And also you have Congress that even if a isolationist president is elected, Congress can kind of force a lot of aid through as well. And so we do have these co-equal branches of government, but they also need support from the U.S. administration.
That was Daniel Lippman, Washington reporter for Politico, who told me what's in the package. There was also an overnight stay in Kyiv. It's the fourth visit, I think, that's been made so far now from the US to stay and visit in Ukraine. And I think staying overnight was also a bit of a show of support to say, look, we're here, we will provide you with support for as long as it's needed. But as Daniel's just explained there, we don't know how long that will be.
Stephen Fry's in Kyiv as well, I see from the Times.
Oh, right.
He was rushed to a bomb shelter in Kyiv after a missile alert. He's there to co-host a meeting set up by Elena Zelenska, First Lady of Ukraine, to discuss mental health issues with the spouses of world leaders. Yet again, more proof there's no story whatsoever which doesn't have a mental health angle these days. So Stephen Fry is in Kiev and was sent down to a shelter. Happily, he's okay.
And a physical risk rather than just a mental risk there in trying to tell that story.
Then he posted a picture of himself in a cafe, so it does have a happy ending. Now,